Now, we're really honored to have our next speaker join us now. Tom Murphy is a senior resident fellow at the Urban Land Institute, and this organization studies how to produce quality product for jobs throughout the country, and particularly in urban areas like the Tampa Bay MSA. So this is the expert we're looking for. He was a 3-term mayor of Pittsburgh, and helped to leverage $4.5 billion of economic development investment in the city, and over $1 billion of funding for 2 professional sports franchises and a convention center, which is the largest certified green building in the United States. He also worked with strategic partnerships to transform more than 1,000 acres of blighted, abandoned industrial properties into new commercial, residential, retail, and public uses. Tom also served in the 8 terms in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives and focused on changing Western Pennsylvania's economy from industrial to entrepreneurial. He wrote the legislation known as the Ben Franklin Technology Partnership, which we've competed with at the state level for years. This is over 25 years ago, and it was dedicated to advancing Pennsylvania's focus on early-stage startup businesses and the commercialization of cutting-edge technologies. He was really had a huge role in transforming Pennsylvania's economy, and we are honored to have him here joining us today, Mr. Tom Murphy.
Good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here, and I really enjoyed the discussion earlier, and it really, I think, sets this up. This is about you. It's not about money. It's not about whether we ought to put roads in or do this or that. It is about whether you have the community will to change, because you're not doing the right things now. No city is, because the rules are fundamentally changing in the world today. I get a chance to travel with the Urban Land Institute all over the world. And whether it's Hong Kong or Shanghai or Toledo or County or Pittsburgh or a host of other cities, every city is trying to figure out their place in the world. And the cities that are beginning to succeed have been very intentional about their choices. And that's what's remarkable about you all sitting here for a day or so, is that you're being very intentional, trying to decide what you should do as a community to compete in this world that's getting redefined. And there's a great metaphor for that. How many of you know who Horatio Nelson Jackson is? We have one person. You all fail American history. He changed your life. Horatio Nelson Jackson was a doctor in Vermont, and he was in California at a medical convention, and he went out to dinner with a group of doctors, and they were debating the impact of automobile in American society. And all those doctors, as smart as they were, thought it was a toy for the rich and wasn't going to have much impact. And Horatio believed it was a game changer, and he bet them all $50 he could drive across the United States in 90 days. And the very next day, he went out and bought his first car. He convinced the young mechanic, Sewall Crocker, to go with him. And for whatever reasons that day, they bought a dog named Bud. And the very next day, with no planning, no support, Horatio, Sewall, and Bud are driving across the United States. It was 1903. And in 1903, there were 8,000 cars in America, 150 miles of paved roads, and no highway department in any state. 63 days later, they drove down Fifth Avenue in New York City. They were the first people to drive across the United States. By 1923, sort of that time frame that you're all talking about and thinking about where Pinellas County ought to go, by 1923, there were 10 million cars, hundreds of thousands of miles of paved road, and a highway department in every state. Society as we knew it changed completely in those 20 years. In 1903, there were 55,000 harness makers in America, very comfortable in their profession. By 1923, there were 2,500. I want you to think about what you are living through right now with newspapers, with how we buy things, what's happening with Penny's and Sears and all the big department stores who might lay off 500,000 people this year because how we buy things are changing dramatically. We are living at a moment when the forces of change are fundamentally defining the rules by which cities will succeed or fail. Globalization is doing that as you compete for manufacturing or for whatever other kind of industries. You're not competing with Orlando or Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, you're competing with Hong Kong and Vietnam and places all over the world. Environmental issues are fundamentally challenging the choices you ought to make about how you build and how you live. One of the old issues about crossing the bridge, that is about mobility. It's about how people move around in areas. It's not simply about whether we all drive. It's about how you move populations. Companies want to locate in a place where there's good mobility, where they can get their employees back and forth to work easily with not having to sit for an hour and a half in congestion. They're all the technological innovation. Just take out your phone and look at what that has done in terms of changing the world and how we get information. You can't lie anymore, right? People can immediately look up what you said on Google to see whether you're telling the truth anymore. You can't embellish anything. We are watching demographics. You've heard time and time again. It is fundamentally a force changing the world. And that demographic of what is happening to your community and whether you're going up and down in that demographics, and we'll talk about that further. It is fundamentally defining real estate in the whole world. How communities make decisions to pay for the future. You know, one of the lessons I learned as mayor is that you can get consumed with today. Kids are shooting each other. You need to fix the potholes. You don't need to worry about this. I had to get the snow off the road in the winter. And that can eat up all your time and all your budget, spending on just today. And if you do that, you're going to just be here in today. But you need to think about, as a community, how do you invest in the future? And how do you take some resources when people don't want to have any higher taxes to think about investing in the future? If you don't invest in the future, you're condemned to stay where you are. And you can't stay where you are because the world is changing so dramatically. And then we've heard about talent, and I'll talk about that further because talent is everything. It is driving the economy of the world now, of where talent is. And this is you. This is you over the last 25 years. You've lost 20% of your manufacturing jobs in the last 25 years, but in the last 25 years, your professional and business services, and by the way, this is the MSA in Tampa, you've increased your professional and business services 375%. So where in 1990 you had more people working in manufacturing than you did in professional services or in education and healthcare, now you have 2 or 3 times more people working in those professions than you do in manufacturing. They're your growth industries. You know, but they need different things than the traditional manufacturing does. And so when you look at the trends in your community in terms of employment, you need to understand what that means. This is not unusual. If you look at those other sample cities, Baltimore lost 56% of their manufacturing jobs, and Philadelphia lost 47%. And some of that could come back, and I believe we're going to have a renaissance in manufacturing, but it's going to be driven by technology. And so there's a new steel mill that's just been built in Pittsburgh, $2.5 billion investment, traditional manufacturing. I know the people that made the investment. I said, why did you build this new steel mill in Pittsburgh, right? Strong union city. And he said, because labor's not a big issue anymore. You know, transportation costs coming from China are more expensive for us. Where 5,000 people would have been making steel 20 years ago in that mill, there are now 400. And most of them are wearing white suits because they're driving computers that are driving the manufacturing process. Manufacturing is going to look very different than it did 20 years ago. And so you need to recognize that as you think about what the future Pinellas County is going to be. This is an example. These are 5 cities in Ohio, just to give you a sense of what we have been through. When I start talking about this Horatio Nelson moment, this is what it's about. This is the manufacturing jobs in 5 cities in Ohio, in Akron and Youngstown and Cleveland and Cincinnati and Columbus. And you can see they lost over a relatively short period of time, 20 years, almost 100,000 manufacturing jobs. That fundamentally changed their economy. And you can expect moving forward 20 years that there's going to be this kind of remarkable change happening in cities everywhere. Demographics. There are 2 big bubbles in the demographic. There are those that look like me with gray hair. And how many of you belong to ARP? Go ahead, give it up. You can join at 50, okay? If you belong to ARP, you know that virtually they put out great monthly magazines. Everybody in real estate ought to read them, but in every other issue, there's an article about where boomers want to live. We don't want to sit in our couch in front of a television all the time. We want to be active. We want to live. And where do boomers want to live? These are the people from 50 to 65 years old. They want to live in walkable communities. They want to live with vibrancy and lots of arts and culture, maybe good trails, maybe a university where they can take a couple courses. That's the kind of place they want to win. Is that describing St. Pete's? And you're seeing that happen. And even more dramatically are our kids. The largest demographic bubble in America, and you've heard about the millennials ad nauseum, but what is real about them is they're driving the choices companies are making about where to locate now, because they are lots of talent, but they are also 6 times less likely to own an automobile than their parents did at 24. I have a 26-year-old son who doesn't even have a driver's license. So, when I was 24 years old, having the right car was everything, right? It was a 57 Chevy, right? And it was having the right car. And now kids don't care about cars. They care about mobility. And so you have Zipcar and Cars to Go and Uber and bike share and a host of other things that cities have begun to create to give people choices about mobility. And you need to think about that as a community. What is your mobility? Do I have to depend to get from point A to point B just on an automobile and that's my only choice? Well, that's not a competitive advantage then. That for employers, that becomes important. I can give you an example. Google opened an operation in Pittsburgh, 800 jobs in an old Nabisco bakery that was vacant. I'll show you a picture of it later. 60% of their employees either walk or ride a bike to work. Can I do that here? You need to think about that because that is a competitive advantage. 50% of the people in Washington, D.C. do not own an automobile. 60% of the people in New York City do not own an automobile. That is an issue of a community, of how your community works, how people move around in your community. So it's about intentionality. I can make choices. You have a bond issue coming up. You can say, I don't want to raise taxes because, and that question over here that he's left now, I thought was an important question because he basically asked, I'm looking at this chart and it's almost an inverse ratio. The higher the places the taxes are, the more competitive they are. Did you notice that? And you have a segment of your community that believe the lower the taxes, the more competitive we're going to be. I can make a case for you that the highest tax places in regions in the country are the most competitive ways. If I go to Texas, the places that have the highest taxes are Dallas and Houston. What's going on there? They're booming. If I look at New York City or Washington or virtually any other state across the country, I can look at the high tax areas and say, they're probably doing the best economically of any place. I'm not encouraging you to vote for higher taxes. All I'm saying to you is that people that have made choices to invest in their community, whether it's in mobility or education or a host of other, or the universities, are the communities that are the most competitive. Now as to what's happening in the world today. And so you need to think about that as a community. Intentionally, what are we going to invest in? And this is about risk. And I was in politics a lot of years. Risk and politics don't mix, right? It's like, but unless your community is willing to embrace risk, by saying we need to invest in the future, and that might work and it might not, but we need to try to make the investment. I believe that there are 4 things that every community needs to focus on right now. One is land control, and you've heard about that. You need to think about, where are you going to get the next investment? If I'm a company and I show up in your community and I say, I'll put a manufacturing facility here, and you say to me, well, we'll have the land ready for you in 18 months, I'm going somewhere else. And so how does that happen? You've heard, you have sites here. We were a built-out community. Lots of communities are built out. You need to figure out how you recycle those sites. And it might be that you as a government need to take a risk to buy that land and do what this young man said, which is to get it ready. So you can knock on people's doors and say, you want to come here, you can come here tomorrow. It's permitted and ready to go. But that means you're going to take a risk. You need to make those investments up front as a community to get ready for the future. There are choices. So land control is one. The other is flexible funding. Your ability to be entrepreneurial as a public, to make investments in public-private partnerships. The other is to have a really sophisticated staff so that you're not getting your pocket picked by some developer who shows up and says, you know, I'll do this and this and this if you give me this and this and this, and you give them this and this and this, and nothing happens. You need somebody that understands what the market is and where the investments and how you protect yourself. But most of all, you need to know where you want to go. So I would have developers, when I was mayor, come and say, Mayor, I have a great idea for you. And particularly when they knew we were doing deals. And I would say, with all due respect, you tell us why it's a great deal for you, and we'll decide whether it's a great deal for us. And if our self-interests meet, we'll be great partners, and we'll share the risk with you. We'll help you make it happen. That assumed we knew what we wanted. You need to not be reactive. You need to be proactive. You need to know the kind of community you want to have. You have an environmental stewardship here that you need to protect. So when somebody comes and says, I want that waterfront, you need to be prepared to say, we really want you to be here, but that waterfront's going to be a public park. You can't give up your values. You need to understand what your values are and be proactive in the kind of community you want to have. That speaks to transportation. It speaks to how do you develop your communities, all your different communities. So I'm going to run over a few examples of, I think, cities that have been very intentional in how they've tried to position themselves in this world that's getting turned upside down. Minneapolis, years ago, 179 local governments decided that they were going to, rather than compete with each other, put all their money in a common pot, 40% of the money from new development, property taxes from new developments, into a common pot, and all share it. Can you imagine that happening here? All the communities in Hillsborough County and Pinellas County kicking in their money from new development and sharing it? It must be in the water, right? So you all compete with each other. So you're spending half your resources probably competing with each other rather than competing with Hong Kong and Vietnam and Pittsburgh and the rest of the world. How does that happen? There are probably a lot of people that have come down here for the warm weather from Minneapolis. How does Minneapolis succeed? It has 30 degrees below zero weather 3 months a year, and it's nowhere near an ocean. So what's the quality of life there? It is booming, and people love Minneapolis, St. Paul, because they've figured out how to build on their assets. They've been forward-thinking in the choices they've made. In Denver, how many of you have been to Denver lately? Some of you might remember the old Union Station in Denver, which was essentially an abandoned railroad station, 2 trains a day running through it. The mayor of Denver in 2004, Republican and Democratic leaders from the whole region, 7 counties and 32 municipalities, when Republican and Democrats could talk to each other, they stood up together and said, we need to invest in Denver's future. We need to invest to build a 120-mile transit system and raise the sales tax to finance it. It wasn't waiting for the federal government or the state government. It was the citizens of that region saying, we want to invest in our future. One of the arguments was we're losing the whole Front Range, which is the part of the beauty of Denver because it, one is the beauty and the other was getting sprawled and polluted by all the fumes of people driving. So the citizen voted to approve that. It passed. 7 counties. It's now largely built. If you go to Union Station in Denver, you'll see almost $2 billion worth of development in what were 30 acres of abandoned railroad yards. You'll see, this is where that transit system comes in. You'll see 3,500 residential units. There are 78 transit stops on that, out into the suburban areas, many of them small suburban communities that weren't doing very well. Half of them now have major developments in them, transit-oriented development connected to this transit, because I can live in Aurora, Colorado, 25 or 30 miles outside of Denver and get on transit and get in there very easily and don't need to worry about driving in the traffic for an hour and a half. They made that choice. It has fundamentally put Denver on the map. You saw in some of those locations, millennials are flocking to Denver because it has great mobility, it has a great series of jobs that are now being created, and has a very entrepreneurial climate. Cleveland, a Rust Belt city, did something pretty remarkable, which is that they made a decision through 5 counties to create a unified parks commission, because they recognized that parks was one of the really important pieces of what makes a great community. And so they have the spectacular park they call the Green Necklace that runs through 5 counties, connected. It has its own funding source, so it's not competing with police or other like that. So they made a decision in a very intentional way to take something that we all sort of take for granted and as an afterthought often, and to say we're going to connect this and build really a spectacular park system. In Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is located, and I'll talk more about this, but Allegheny County made a decision at the bottom of the barrel when we were really a flat broke place. The citizens of Allegheny County made a decision to raise the taxes on themselves by 0.5% to invest in what we call regional asset districts. So this are the libraries, the parks, the symphony, the ballet. These were all things that were important to us and that were being threatened because of the economic collapse of Pittsburgh. But we as citizens said, these are important to us, even though we are in tough economic times, we're prepared to raise the taxes to invest in these assets. It included building ballparks and other things like that. How many of you have been to Charleston? What do you think? Is it the best small city in America? Probably is, right? Joe Rowley was mayor for 40 years, and Joe Rowley made a decision. He's going to be speaking here in a couple months, I guess. Joe Rowley made a decision when he became a mayor at 33 years old that historic preservation was going to be the driver in the future of Charleston. And, you know, when people said, he has a slide, he said, you know, we had this wonderful old building. It's a beautiful old Victorian building. And he said, you know, we didn't like it. Instead, we tore it down, and this is what we wanted. It's a Motel 6. Well, we all laugh, right? But we've all done it. So Joe Rowley recognized that historic preservation as an idea of how you shape a city, about the fundamental value of a city and how you make that happen was very important, and has made Charleston into what I think is the best small city in America. Greenville, South Carolina, you saw it as one of your competitors. Greenville, South Carolina was going nowhere. The stores were all vacant downtown. The state had put a highway over this waterfall that was in right downtown Greenville, South Carolina, 4-lane highway, and put a 4-lane road right through the middle of the main street, okay? Took the sidewalks away, very narrow sidewalks, all the stores shut down because they needed to get people through Greenville. And the mayor of Greenville at some point said, you know, this doesn't work. We want to tear this bridge down. Can you imagine? And people said, well, I use that bridge every day to get through Greenville. Don't tear it down. And we want to narrow the street to 2 lanes rather than 4 lanes and widen the sidewalks and start trying to do stuff along our main street. If you go to Greenville now, how many of you have been to Greenville? Am I telling the truth? It's booming. It wasn't an accident. It was a very intentional decision on the part of that mayor to take a big political risk to tell people, you're just going to have to go around Greenville and take a little bit more time to get through the city. But we want that waterfall back. And if you go there at lunchtime, it is the best park I've been in. I'll drive 100 miles out of the way just to go to Greenville to go for a run through that park, because it's such a beautiful place. And the downtown, booming apartments and performing arts center, lots of businesses now locating there. They made a choice about the kind of city they wanted to be. They didn't sort of drift into it or say, this is the way it is, what are we going to do? Probably the best example of a partnership is in the Research Triangle. If you've been up there, you know it's between Durham, Chapel Hill, and Raleigh. And this is a true story. About in the 1960s, 6 guys were out playing golf, got rained out. They're in the country club lamenting the fact that they spend all this money to send their kids to college and their kids never come back because there's nothing to do there. It is tobacco and lumber. And those 6 guys went out and bought 7,000 acres of land between Raleigh-Durham and Chapel Hill, and they called it the Research Triangle. And they began to work with the state and the 3 local governments and the 3 great universities that were there. And if you go there today, you'll know it's had one of the highest per capita incomes in America. It has 50,000 people working there. They're redoing it with housing now and other stuff. But it is driven the economics of that region in a way that probably no other place in America did. It was an intentional decision. It didn't happen by accident. It happened because these 6 guys privately decided to really be leaders in their community and decide to position themselves not to be what they've always been, but to be different, and understood the world was changing and they could compete, but they needed to change their behavior. And that brings me to Pittsburgh. I was mayor of Pittsburgh from 1994 to 2006, 12 years. And Pittsburgh the billboards in Pittsburgh when I was coming mayor were the last person out shut the lights off. How would you like that for your slogan? Why was that the slogan? Because between 1970 and 1990, 500,000 people left Pittsburgh. That's why how many of you are Steeler fans? That's why we have so many Steeler fans all over America, because people left. Okay, and we became the second oldest county in America. Dade County is the oldest. And it wasn't because people were retiring to Pittsburgh. It was because all our young people were leaving. Because the steel industry, because of globalization, collapsed. And so Pittsburgh's population, the city itself, went from 620,000 people to 300,000. So when I'm becoming mayor, we're a population of 300,000 people. From when I'm a young boy, when it was 620,000. I want you to think about that. So if you think you have it tough, don't talk to me. I know what tough is. Our unemployment rate was 20%. And so that's our city. Fast forward to today, Pittsburgh is ranked by The Economist magazine and Forbes as the most livable place in America. How did that happen? It happened because we made very intentional decisions. You're nowhere near where we were. But if you don't make the right decisions, you will languish. So this was our population. You can see in a relatively short period of time, 20 years, we lost 500,000 people. And so we all worked in steel. That's where we worked. 60% of our workforce was in heavy manufacturing. And then it wasn't. That all disappeared. And we needed to think about what we were going to become. And the universities, Carnegie Mellon University and the University of Pittsburgh, were in Pittsburgh for 150 years. You know, they did research, they taught people. And the president of Carnegie Mellon University, first person I ever heard say, we, the universities, could be the economic engines of the region. And this is in the early 80s. And I said, what do you mean by that? I mean, you can't hire all these retired or these laid-off steel workers to work in the university. I mean, there's a mismatch of skills, number one. And he said, no, we are creating the future. And we as a region in Pittsburgh are not positioned to take advantage of. And he rattled off a dozen people who had graduated from Carnegie Mellon University who had moved to Boston or to Silicon Valley to start jobs. They're your kids also that are graduating from the universities here. And so he said, what do we need to do? And he said, we need to think about what it means to create an entrepreneurial culture. And I don't know what that meant at the time. And so he said, we are the coal mines. And the coal mines have this product, but it has no value unless you build an infrastructure to take advantage of it. And that infrastructure, it starts with the universities of having internally an entrepreneurial culture that encourages their students or their professors or others to understand how to think about commercializing the ideas they're coming up with. And then it takes the community to think about how do you create the availability of venture capital and early stage financing and a host of, and training for a young woman who has an idea but has, no idea about marketing or the legal stuff or what it means. How do you build that infrastructure? And we were a city of big unions and big corporations. We never thought much about this, and we had to completely change our culture. But the results now is that our employment now is surpassing when the steel industry was booming. And 10% of our workforce now is in manufacturing, and about 40 or 50% is in technology. So, and so we had acres of old real estate. So we had thousands of acres of abandoned steel mills and old buildings. This is an old Nabisco bakery. And it was sitting there vacant, and Google was doing some research at Carnegie Mellon University, started just 8 years ago with 2 people that now have about 800 people in Pittsburgh. And they didn't move out to a fancy new office park out in the suburbs. They said, we want to be in this building, in what was a gritty neighborhood of Pittsburgh. If anybody of you know Pittsburgh, we see Liberty, and we want to locate there. And the developer who had an option on that, who was dying because he didn't know who would ever go in that building now, thinks he's died and gone to heaven, and he's rehabbed that building, and now Google's in that building. You can see how they transformed the building. And I mentioned a major part of their workforce now lives around there, so there are hundreds of new housing units that are built in what was one of the worst neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. We have, if you come to Pittsburgh, you can take a driverless Uber car. Are you ready for that? There are 150 Uber cars on the streets of Pittsburgh that do not have drivers. Uber has put 600 jobs in Pittsburgh. It's their technical research center. And they're using the city as their laboratory. And we've been open to that. And so you can order an Uber car, and you can tell them you want a driverless one, and it will come and pick you up and take you where you want to go. Now, I had this funny experience. I was leading a bike tour a few months ago in Pittsburgh, and we came to this intersection just as a driverless car came to the intersection. And for the first time in my life, I had like the hair in the back of my neck went up. I felt like this machine was looking at me. And it was trying to decide what I was going to do. And, that's a scary moment. Okay, and it was waited for us to commit ourselves whether we were going to go this way or that way. And then we did, and then it went on its way. Are you ready for that? Are you ready for what that means? It's not the future. It's coming now. We live it every day in Pittsburgh. And what does that mean for manufacturing? Because this is not just about driverless cars. This is about artificial intelligence. This is about machines making critical decisions. So that little thing you can see on the top of that car is like a tin can, and it's spinning around very fast, and it's doing 1,500 calculations a second. So it's looking around and seeing everything that's moving and what's there, and then it's translating that information into decisions about where it's going to go or not and how fast it's going to go. Think about what that means for manufacturing. So when you think about trying to attract manufacturers, don't think about today. Think about 5 years from now and the kind of manufacturing that's going to be happening, because it's happening now. And it has huge implications for all of us of how we position ourselves. So we had land, as I mentioned, we had thousands of acres of vacant steel mills, and we had lost half of our population in 20 years. So if you were a real estate developer and I said, hey, we want to do a deal with you on an old steel mill, what would you say to me? We're going somewhere else. So we needed to figure out how we get people to imagine a different kind of Pittsburgh. So literally, our riverfronts were filled with abandoned steel mills. And so we made a very critical decision. It was very controversial. People were very mad at me about it. We reduced the city's workforce, and we diverted $6 million and created a $60 million development fund because we felt we needed money. The second thing we did is, the first year I was mayor, we bought 1,500 acres of abandoned steel mills. My opponent, the next time I ran, his whole campaign was pictures of vacant land, saying the mayor wasted all of our money on this land when we could have hired more police. That's a fundamental decision communities need to make. Do you invest in today only, or do you invest in tomorrow? So we bought this steel mill, and my father, for me, this was a very emotional, this is one of several major properties we bought, but this was a very emotional decision when I was mayor, directing our Economic Development Authority to buy this, because my father worked in the steel mill for 51 years. So now where there were 10,000 men and women making steel, there's a cheesecake factory. My father would shoot me if he were alive, right? But there's also, it's 120 acres. You can see this, and it was a public-private partnership. We put about $130 million of public money in that. of cleaning it up, of putting the infrastructure in. You can imagine, this was a steel mill for 100 years. We put a big, great park all along the riverfront. It is a mixed-use development. It has housing. It has retail. It has a dozen or so office buildings that are hiring a new generation of Pittsburghers, but in a different kind of job. And it has generated not 650, there's almost $800 million of development there now. So some of you, American Eagle, do any of you buy American Eagle clothes for your kids? If you buy American Eagle decided to move their headquarters from New York in a suburban area in Pittsburgh onto this site and built 3 buildings and put hundreds of jobs there. Why did they do that? Because they love the vibrancy of the place, and it had parks. This park along that river goes all the way to Washington, D.C. And so they wanted to be there because it was such a great place to be. So, and then we had a downtown that was failing, and this was led by our foundations, who recognized that arts and culture can be a huge economic driver and really important for the success. So in an area that used to be our red light district, with 22 massage parlors and strip joints, some people are laughing. Does this sound familiar? You must have a place like that too. The foundations began to buy buildings, and there are now 1,500 legitimate performances going on there. The ballet, the opera. Oh, you got it. You were a little slow on the uptake. The ballet, the opera, the symphony, theater are all there. 2 million people a year go to this place for the culture and the arts. There are no porno theaters, one actually strip joint, but I think every city probably ought to have one strip joint, right? But everything else is gone. And it is now all the older buildings with the upstairs are all apartments or condos, lots of restaurants. It is a booming place that was as dead as a doornail 25 years ago. That was the partnership. We weren't the leaders on that. The foundations were, but we were good partners with them in making it happen. We had riverfronts. You know, and when I was growing up, my mother would always say to me 2 things: be home before the streetlights come on, and she would say, never get near the rivers. She'd say, if you go in those rivers, you're going to melt, because they were so polluted, okay? And so none of us ever went to the river. We turned our back on our waterfront. And when this pure selfishness on part, I'm a runner and a biker, and so I wanted the riverfronts, and so we had less than a mile of riverfront public access when I became mayor. Now we have 30 miles, and there's a bike trail that runs from Pittsburgh all the way to Washington, D.C., completely off-road. If any of you are bikers, it's a great 5-day ride, and it's completely off-road on an incredible trail. It's awesome. Lots of history, lots of scenery. And so now Alcoa was going to build. It's funny how companies think people that ride bikes are all thieves, you know? Do you ever notice that? Is that we wanted to put this bike trail behind. We had a property at Alcoa, a major international company, wanted to build a new headquarters building, but they didn't want that trail. They were worried about security on the river. And we said, you know, we really want you to locate in the city, but we need 50 feet. You need to move your building back, because that trail is really part of what we're going to be as a city. And same with PNC Bank. I know do business there. They're headquartered in Pittsburgh, and they were going to build a major operations center, 2,500 jobs, and they encroached on where we wanted to build a trail, and we had to tell their architects. And the chairman of the board, I had to call up a PNC and say, you need to move your building back 50 feet. We want to put a trail in there, and it's part of what we see as the new Pittsburgh. And he said, oh, we're going to move our building to the suburbs, somewhere else out into an office park. But then they made a decision that was there a benefit. So Alcoa and PNC Bank and a host of other companies redesigned their buildings. They put locker rooms in for their employees, so that the locker rooms, their employees can ride a bike back and forth to work, or go out and work out on the trail on a lunchtime and come back in. It changed the culture of our city. If you would think about now taking away these riverfront trails, there'd be a revolution. So it's those kinds of things. As you're doing development on your waterfront, your spectacular waterfront, you should be thinking, Joe Raleigh would say in Charleston, that the most important property in a community should be in the public realm. Don't give away your waterfront. Think about it. It might take 50 years, but think about how you weave a great public access to this, one of the most spectacular potential waterfronts in the country, okay? Think about that. And so this is about growing talent. The University of South Florida gets almost $500 million a year in research. Where is that research going? Because that research is is largely coming here competitively. The NIH and others are making the decisions that you're doing cutting-edge research, and they want to invest in it because you have world-class researchers here. Do you know what that is? And are you focused on that as a potential job opportunity of creating? Who wants to be near that research? And so Carnegie Mellon University, as an example, was for years doing research in artificial intelligence. 22 years ago, when I'm first mayor, we financed a national robotics center with CMU, and we thought, wow, this is going to create lots of jobs right away. 20 years later, the world has come to us. But because of the technology being developed at CMU. So you need to know, that's an economic driver for you, and you need to know what that research is. You also need to know that in order to keep your young people here, some of your talent is you need to figure out how to make available venture capital and early stage financing. So wealthy people in the community, we required our state, when I was a legislator, we required our state pension funds to invest up to 2% of their assets into venture capital firms if they would open an office in Pennsylvania. We went from having no venture capital firms with offices in Pittsburgh to having 17. Changed the conversation. And they didn't need to make investments in Pennsylvania, but they needed to give us a first look, our startup companies. It changed the conversation. There's a ULI publication, I think you have it in front of you, and this speaks a little bit about how cities, whether it's Greenville or Pittsburgh or other Cincinnati or other cities around the country, made choices about how they form effective partnerships and provide financing to attract companies. I agree with your economic people before me that is a conversation of last minute, but in the front end, it is also important about how the public money is used to position you to compete. So whether you have land available or not that is in the condition that can compete, whether you have the mobility available that employers are comfortable that their workforce is going to be able to easily get to their place. So you might want to look at that. There are 6 case studies that we talk about in it. And it has a glossary of financial terms. It was not unusual for us when we're doing that Southside development or 100 other developments that we might have 7 or 8 or 10 different sources of financing to make the deal work. In the front end with the developer, in the back end with the company coming in. And we were in a city that had no market. And so this was very helpful. So very quickly to close, there are several pieces of the puzzle. You need to know what you want to be and where you want to go. You need to first recognize that the rules of the game are changing, and what you were before are not necessarily what you're going to be now in the future. And how do you change that? And what's the challenge? And who's going to lead that? And I want you to, I don't know how many of you have been to New York City, if you've been there and seen the High Line. For me, it's the best example in the country of where 99% of the people in New York City saw this as a liability. It was a railroad trestle 30 feet in the air that runs from 20th Street to 40th Street on the west side of Manhattan Island. It had been there since 1960, abandoned. And it was just there, rotting away. And the city had a public meeting to propose to tear it down, and a group of young people came and said, you don't want to tear that down, that could be a great asset. And the mayor, Bloomberg, to his credit, listened to them and set up a group, and if you go there now, I think it's one of the most visited places in New York City and has generated billions of dollars of development along that area. The largest development happening in America over the railroad yards by related companies just north of here. If you see their brochure, they'll say this is a $60 billion development, and they'll say our development is at the end of the High Line. So imagine something that 10 years ago was seen as a liability is now the marketing ploy for the major development in the United States. So that's how you need to think about your community, not that's a wasted piece of property. The other is somebody needs to be the leader. It could be your county commissioners. It can be your business leadership. It can be different people, but somebody needs to be willing to lead and to challenge people's assumptions. You need partnerships. Everything we did was a partnership. Whether we were doing development or whether we were looking to get state help or doing new roads or whatever we were doing was all based on partnerships and how you build those. And clearly, the most important partnership we had was with the universities. And so if I say Marriott and Google and Motorola and Kraft Foods and Fifth Third and General Electric and Rolls-Royce, and I'll add Caterpillar and McDonald's to that, what do they all have in common? They've all moved their headquarters operations, thousands of jobs, from suburban locations into cities in the last 2 years. General Electric moved from a 74-acre campus in bucolic, Connecticut countryside with thousands of spaces for parking and surface parking into downtown Boston. McDonald's, if you've ever been, had to speak at the McDonald's. McDonald's had a lovely campus in a very nice suburban community in Chicago, and to get there, I flew in and had to take 2 subways and a cab to get to their campus. They're moving their whole operation to downtown Chicago. Marriott has moved their whole operation from an office park into Bethesda, which is a suburban community, but an urbanized suburban community with a place, with vibrancy, arts and culture, restaurants. For the first time in history, I believe we are watching something really remarkable. We're always before people moved to where jobs were. Now we're beginning to see jobs move to where people are. They're going after talent. So if you're going to compete, you need to understand St. Pete's is positioned to compete. You need to think about how other parts of your county position themselves to compete. That means public investment and private investment to shape a kind of community where people want to be, where they not only can find good jobs and diverse jobs, but where they can be. So, and the other is when you build something, build about this. So this is a parking lot, right? We all have them everywhere. This was right in front of the entrance to the University of Pittsburgh, a great institution, 20,000 people. On either side of it are museums. On the upside of it was a park. And this is what we thought was the highest and best use of that land, a parking lot of 600 okay. And we decided this is what I call the it'll do disease, right? What's the best thing we can do with this property? This parking lot, it'll do. So we decided it wasn't going to do anymore, and so we decided we were going to take the parking lot out. And of course, 600 people said, we're never voting for you again if you take my parking place away, right? But now there's a spectacular park where on any summer day, thousands of students and people are hanging out. There's a little restaurant there. You can buy food, and it has created this sense of place. It's about placemaking. It's about creating great places in your community. So when I come into Tampa, or into St. Pete's Airport, and you have a sign, welcome to St. Pete, Clearwater, and it says we're a world-class community, we're a green community, we're a friendly community. You would never think to put on that community, we're a mediocre community, would you? But you do that by what you build. If I come into your community and I see lots of billboards and lots of surface parking and helter-skelter kind of development, it says something about your values. So when I'm a company coming here, I'm going to think about that, okay? And that's important about the kind of and you control that. You control that through the kind of community and the zoning and everything you want. So we're where Horatio Nelson Jackson was. We're sitting looking at a future. It's fundamentally getting redefined. And I've been there, done that, okay? I've heard every reason why we shouldn't do something. I've been to 1,000 meetings where 100 people have been. It said, that's the wrong place, it's the wrong color, it's too big, it's too small, and never do we have enough money to do that. They define the agenda. But what I've learned is that if you want to go to the future, the fundamental, most important thing is whether you have the political and community will to reach for the future. You can stay where you are. You're doing okay. But you're doing okay. If you want to be really great, you need to reach for the future. That's your choice. It's no other. You need to have that sense of urgency, and you need to be willing to challenge the status quo. If you're not willing to do that, get out of the road, because the world's coming towards you one way or the other. So I'm going to challenge you. I come back here fairly regularly. I'd like to think that you've made a decision to reach for the future. And I'll see that by what kind of choices you make and how you build your relationships with the universities, of how you make a choice of the kind of development you want to do, of whether you support investing in your future or not in this bond issue coming up. They're all the kind of choices that you control. It's not about somebody else. It's not about the state. It's not about whether a company's going to locate here. It's about the kind of community you want to have and whether you have the political and community courage to invest in it. Do it. Good luck. Do I have time for questions? No questions. Did I scare you all? Yeah.
Mayor, just curious, what did you do with the parking at the university?
People figure it out. I mean, you know what? That's a metaphor for change. People do not like change, but they'll figure it out. We didn't do anything. They figured it out. I mean, I just want to give you one other example just to follow up on that. I didn't show this, but we had an old football stadium and baseball park called Three Rivers Stadium, and it was surrounded by 30 acres of parking. It was built in 1970. And for lots of reasons, we made a decision we were going to build a new baseball park, and the Steelers came and said, well, if you're going to build a new baseball park, we ought to build a new football stadium. And then the hotel people came and said, we have a really terrible convention center. If you want to, you're going to do those, we need to be first. We need a new convention center because we being businesses. And I'm a new mayor, 3 months in, absolutely flat broke city. And I said, rather than us fighting with each other, to which one's going to come first and which one's going to come second. Let's build all three of them at the same time, right? It's easy to say when you have no money, right? And I have no idea how we're going to find it. And so the business community gets behind it, and we put together what we call a regional renaissance effort, and we want to raise the sales tax a half a cent. And it will pay for the ballparks, the convention center, and other economic development activities. And it was a multi-county. It was 5 counties, and we put the vote up to a ballot. We are not normally a referendum state, but our legislators, the brave people that they were, didn't want to get near it, and so they made it a referendum, okay? And so people voted on it, and 70% of the people voted against it. And 2 county commissioners who were my buddies, one was a Republican and one was a Democrat, the 3 of us a month and a half later stood up and said, we're going to build them anyhow and figure out how to do it without another referendum. So everybody was mad. My 2 partners, they never ran. They gave up their political careers. They never ran again. We built these facilities. We built the best baseball park in America by everybody's measure, built a new football stadium, built the largest certified green building in America with our convention center. And just last month, I was speaking to 400 people. It was happened to be in the football stadium in like a dining room there. And I said, so, don't you love this place? And everybody clapped. And I said, so how many of you voted against it? Of course, nobody raised their hand. I said, well, you're lying to me because 70% of you voted against it. So come true. And now if you went to Pittsburgh, you'd probably find nobody who was against it. There's $1.5 billion of development between those 2 ballparks where those Sophos parking lots are. It generates $20 million of new revenue a year for the city. It cost us as a city less than $1 million of our own money to make it all happen. I can tell you, you need to imagine a different Pinellas County. You have incredible assets here. You need to imagine how you use those in a way that is very different, what you've sort of incrementally drifted into. Your waterfronts, your industrial areas. So you've got to think about that. I hope you leave here challenged. Good luck.
Thank you so much. Awesome. Oh, incredibly inspiring. I do want to introduce Jim Clore, who's the ULI chapter head for the Tampa Bay area. And ULI, the local chapter, made Tom's visit possible. They sponsored that, and they brought the copies of his latest book for ULI. So They'll be available at the end of the conference today. We want you back here at 2:45. One of the big issues as identified is workforce development, and we've got a whole panel looking at how we do that.